Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, April 11th. Today we're going to return to a discussion of issues pertaining to rural America, a subject we've talked about several times on the show. And we're really pleased and honored to have with us today a real expert in this field, Mr. Tony Pipa. He is a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution, based down in Washington, D.C. He launched and leads the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative, which seeks to modernize and transform U.S. policy to better enable equitable and sustainable development across rural America. He also launched and leads the Local Leadership on the Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, which explores the approach cities and local institutions are taking to solve local problems while driving progress on global policy and transnational issues. Mr. Pipa was also one of the featured speakers at the fourth annual Southern Vermont Economic Summit conference that was held back in 2021. That same event, as many of you know, is coming up next month. It will be held over in Wilmington at the Heritage Club. But today, we're really pleased and delighted to welcome Mr. Pipa to our program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I remember your talk that you gave back 2 years ago that really sparked my interest in this whole subject of rural America versus urban America, for lack of a better term. But I'd be interested to hear your sort of general 30,000-foot appraisal of where rural America is at.
So one, I guess I would say, economically speaking, rural America in general has continued to lag behind urban and suburban areas, especially since the Great Recession of 2008. Labor rate participation and unemployment in rural America hadn't even recovered by the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas those same indicators in urban and suburban areas had not only recovered, they'd actually grown. And then, of course, we experienced the economic and social disruption of the pandemic. There have been some glimmers of acceleration since coming out of the economic disruption of the pandemic, where actually employment in rural areas was a bit faster than it was in some of the other geographies. But it still actually hasn't gotten to the point where it was pre-2008. And I think that's partly because of changes in the national and global economy. This is an economy that tends to reward, for example, information technology and knowledge and the innovation that comes with it. We're starting to live in very much a software world, so to speak. But by the same token, I think that there are other trends, and some of these are related to policy and are not just automatically the economy, where with a lot of capital consolidation and corporate consolidation, it's actually made it quite difficult for less densely populated places and rural areas to hang on to the kinds of institutions that make communities thriving. And that can be anything from bank branches, which we've seen more closures in rural areas than we've seen in other places. Local newspapers, again, more in rural and less densely populated places in small towns than in other places. Even grocery stores and the, just kind of the thing, rural hospitals, an extraordinary amount of closures, over 190 rural hospital closures and consolidations since 2005. And frankly, a lot more, a significant amount of the hospitals that remain in fragile spaces as well. At the same time, there's an enormous amount of opportunity. And when you think about taking action on climate change or a clean energy economy and the new opportunities that might come with a new green economy, many of those are going to be in rural places. You think about where solar farms are going to be, or wind farms, minerals that get mined for batteries, even where the battery manufacturing might take place. regenerative agriculture and new agricultural practices that could capture carbon or reduce methane gases. All of that are real opportunities for rural places, for example. And even as you think about the information economy, this is where a lot of data servers are going to be. You hear things like cryptocurrency mining as becoming an economic development opportunity for rural places. Where there's a real gap, I think, is that we don't have a coherent federal rural policy. There are states that are trying to develop policy and offices that are focused on rural prosperity. But you see other countries, actually, other developed countries like Canada and Ireland that have created a national rural policy and actually created cabinet-level ministers to be focused on those policies. And those policies aren't agriculture. I mean, agriculture is a subset of the rural economy, but it's a much smaller subset than most people realize today. It's only about 7% of rural jobs and employment. And those countries that have created their rural policies have been focusing on things like innovation and resilience for rural places. You know, rural places, just by nature of their less dense population and by nature of their economies, tend to be more vulnerable to shocks, whether it's an economic shock or, say, a weather event or something like that. Many times their economies aren't as diverse as more densely populated places. And so one thing happening can have significant impact, and that impact can really ripple through a community or even a set of communities. I grew up, for example, in northeast central Pennsylvania, where it was a strongly anthracite coal region for a long time. And the loss of anthracite coal, which actually happened before I was born, you know, started a slow, steady decline, which has been hard for those communities to recover from and kind of reinvent themselves as they go forward. And you see that in rural economies. I use that as one example, but you see that in lots of different kinds of rural economies throughout the past several decades.
Yeah, communities that do suffer a big economic change, all of a sudden 300 or 400 jobs are gone. And I wonder if you, as you study communities that have struggled through trying to recover from hard shots like that, are there any keys to why some communities seem to rebound more quickly than others?
It's a great question, and I think this is a big question that we should be having a significant policy discourse about, and that's what frustrates me, and I hope we get to this a little bit. That's what frustrates me, is that we tend to focus a lot on rural politics, like who's voting for whom right now, and how is that different in rural places than it is in urban places. But we hardly ever talk about policy, because I think that's the key question. Like, what's the mix that federal, state, and local governments should be thinking about that enables rural places to be more resilient and to actually take those shocks and stresses and continue to thrive and look for a path to prosperity. I've been doing a podcast called Reimagine Rural, where I actually go and visit with towns, and they're towns where there's some positive change happening. They're all on a different area of the continuum. Some of these towns are really in the beginning stages of kind of their renewal. Some have really fully made it, and they're actually trying to figure out how they protect the integrity of that town, as a lot of outside forces want to come in and make them bigger and put lots more money into them. And as I talk to the people who are really protagonists in working together to help that renewal come about, I think there's a mix of several different things. One, leadership really matters, and that leadership has to be local. And it's often very collaborative. It's very interesting to see, you know, an initial investor or a mayor or someone, like, they might have some ideas, but it's really hard to pull off just one or two people. They start to build kind of groupings here. It might be groupings of business leaders, and then getting together with government leaders, and often they're partnering with an outside organization, actually, that has a lot of expertise and knows how to access public funds and even private funds, because that's another key component. Investment is a really big component of this. And our local rural governments, and again, I'm speaking in big generalities here, there's a lot of diversity across the US. But by and large, our local rural governments are really constrained at this point. They tend to be volunteer elected officials. They tend to be very thinly staffed, maybe a part-time city manager with some administrative staff. And it makes it difficult for them just to ensure they're meeting the responsibility of the services they're providing, like water and sewer and building codes and public safety and emergency services, let alone kind of look over the horizon at, okay, like you say, this factory just left or this industry is changing. How do we need to make sure that we're reinventing ourselves for the future? And so having the expertise of an outside organization, but not just any outside organization, they're usually regionally based because they know the history, they know the assets that are there in a particular community. And they, like I say, they can help facilitate investment. I think a lot of rural areas right now are starved for investment. There's public funds available, but those funds usually tend to go to people or households, and usually for kind of social safety net programs. But investment for reinventing your economy, whether that be public or private investment, is very difficult for rural communities and business owners and groups of business owners actually to come by. And that's one thing that I think we can be thinking a lot harder about, how we can right size and facilitate and make it easier for investment and investment types of dollars to flow to rural communities. And then I think, there are intangibles, and part of it's about hope and part of it's about trust and a community psychology. And the leaders that I talked to in pretty much every place were quite, they were frank about sometimes having to push against apathy or even negativity. You mentioned kind of, what communities have been used to. And so there's this process of transitioning from a heritage and an identity that might have been tied to an industry or might have been tied to a particular set of businesses that were there, or even faith or other things that needs to transition, and to help the community and people to transition to a future without feeling like they're leaving too much behind. So you kind of got to reaffirm that identity and that heritage, but we might need to be someplace new or something new. And how to do that at the same time as you're leveraging what your unique assets are in a particular community and matching that up with what opportunities could be given where the economy or where society is going. Well, that's pretty complicated. That's a pretty complicated mix, and it's not easy to pull off. And it's going to be different in different places. So I think the bottom line, though, is it always starts local. It's local people who need to own this and drive it forward. And it's matching that with the right kind of investment, the right kind of expertise, the right kind of accompaniment that can help that place have capacity to be able to move forward. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it's a lot harder to make work, and you have to go and iterate through some failures, just like any small business owner or entrepreneur might. And when it becomes difficult, making sure that it stays on positive and constructive movement forward, rather than becoming a self-reinforcing set of negativity, is really important for it to be successful.
Well, one of the attempts, I guess, that the federal government is trying to make, I guess, recently passed through Congress was the CHIPS Act that was designed to kind of ramp up investment in semiconductor manufacturing. That's right. a nod to the future, one would think. Do you think that's going to have a big impact on rural areas, or a lot of those fabs, as I guess they're called, are they going to go to places that are already fairly rich in well, technological talent and facilities and support networks, rather than going to some place where none of that exists, but it would be a gigantic shot in the arm for the local economy.
So I think there's significant opportunity out of the CHIPS and Science Act. And there are some specific opportunities for rural. As you say, there's incentives and subsidies for semiconductor manufacturing and fabrication. I think there will be a very specific and intentional effort to ensure that these are going to places in the country that over the last couple of decades haven't been the top prospects for siting those kinds of fabrications or that type of industry. There's, in addition to the semiconductor manufacturing, there is proposal within the CHIPS and Science Act to also invest in new innovation hubs in different parts of the country in the heartland. And in fact, rural areas are stipulated to want to be part of the regions that would be getting some of those technology and innovation hubs. But I think we also can't just assume that with like an Intel plant that's being sited in central Ohio, outside of Columbus, in a fairly rural area in Licking County in New Albany, Ohio. We can't just assume that those who have been underemployed or unemployed in the outlying rural areas will then magically show up to work in those new fabrication places. So I'll continue to use that example. That's going to be 7,000 new jobs in the middle of Ohio. But frankly, the place in which it's sited, even though it's less densely populated, is pretty, those counties actually around that, even though they're fairly rural, are pretty prosperous already. The more distressed, economically distressed places are more on the fringes. They'd be 45 minutes away, let's say. And that's going to require intentional workforce development, like to be able to meet those people where they're at, what kind of training that might be necessary, childcare, elder care, transportation, how to make it available for them to actually go to work at those places. And then, frankly, dealing with some employment issues, past employment histories. There might be there might be criminal histories, there might be addiction issues, things like that. It's going to require actual investment and partnership and a willingness to work with those folks to be able to enable them to take advantage of those jobs. And many of those jobs are non-college jobs, but there might need to be a high school diploma, and so you might need to continue some training and schooling there. And obviously, there would also be training for the jobs. We have to be very intentional about the unique characteristics that people in those rural places might be facing. And frankly, there's going to be some countervailing pressures because those things will attract a lot of outside investment. And so you'll start to see real estate prices go up. You'll start to see land get bought up. And how we manage this, how we not just push people continue out to the fringes or even almost take over towns and remake them, but without the people who are currently living in them. And how well we get the people who are currently living in those towns into those new fabrications, that will be the sign of success.
I wanted to pivot just for a moment to sort of a more cultural question, I guess. One of my takeaways from looking at the state of rural America is that there seems to be a very large grievance factor among some residents, not all, but that seems to be one strain anyway that one picks up on, that there's a sort of sense of anger about being kind of quote unquote left behind, as it were. Yeah. Whether that was deliberate or not, I don't know, but that seems to be a very strong emotion that one hears at least in certain parts of rural America. And I guess I'm also kind of struck by how rural areas in general tend to be more culturally conservative. And I don't know if there's a connection between those two things, but I guess I just wondered what your thoughts were on that sort of grievance factor and why rural areas are just, you know, tend to have that more conservative streak to them than suburban or urban areas do.
Yeah, so I do think culturally that, again, in general, and there's a lot of diversity
Right.
Of rural.
Absolutely.
But, you know, small towns, less densely populated places, rural places tend to be more culturally conservative. I mean, you even see it in the data. They'll have higher rates of church going or affiliation or a faith affiliation, for example. They'll tend to have rates of association over and above that. And, you know, I think part of that's the nature of, you know, I was just in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, for example, for the podcast. Pretty remote place, actually. And they'll say, look, we're choosing to live here. It's not that, you know, I was talking to people who had gone to college and then came back, but they said, but what they love about it is that they have to actually work together to kind of make their town work, to make their own businesses work, to make their families work. They're relying on each other. And I think that brings with it kind of a cultural conservatism. Let's put it that way. On terms of, though, around grievances and even how that translates into voting, I think this is one thing that gets a little frustrating when you're working on rural policy is that everybody wants to talk about rural politics. Because they'll want to look at the voting and they'll say, well, look, you know, votes in rural areas are going a particular way. And that's grievance related, But we're not talking about, like, painting with a broad brush actually allows us, in some respects, to avoid talking about whether there is some failures of policy that the people who are in rural places might actually have a point. Because when you think about it, when you look at trade agreements, when you look at changes in antitrust enforcement, when you look at financialization and corporate consolidation and consolidation of capital, all of which are related to like policies that were created, actually. Those have been the things that have, in some respects, created a lot of pressure on rural places. And it's not like people in rural places voted for those policies or were really had much of a role in advocating for those policies. And in fact, some of them advocated strongly against. And so when they feel as though decision makers don't have their interests best at heart, they're doing it, I think, based on some experience. And so when we don't have a policy discourse that says, well, maybe we need to think somewhat differently, I think we're starting that policy discourse, and the CHIPS and Science Act is a part of that. And actually seeing, for example, the extent to which the gaps in broadband that we still have in rural places across the U.S., how apparent that was in the COVID-19 pandemic and what the implications were for kids to learn, for people to get, you know, medical care, all those different things. We're starting to wake up and realize that, hey, we should be having a constructive policy conversation over here about the policies that we could change. Maybe the politics will take care of themselves at some point. But if we keep only just focusing on the politics, I'm not sure we're going to change much of what the frustrations might be in rural America. My final point on this would be, you know, I placed an op-ed in the New York Times talking about these issues of wanting to have more focus on rural policy. And I got a lot of comments. I got about 1,700 comments. And I'll have to say about 2/3 of them were very negative towards rural places.
Interesting.
So it's not just, I mean, we're in a dynamic now where, you know, people see rural places as having grievances, but they're having grievances against those rural places for having grievances, and nobody wanting to actually think about how do we ensure that as a country we're taking advantage of the potential that rural America offers us. And that's what we need to do, I think, to be strong as a country and strong economically and strong competitively globally. And that's where I hope we get to at some point soon.
Yeah, for sure, no question. It's always interesting when I think about the way the country is politically set up. Every state has the same number of senators, and a lot of states seem to be. I don't know. One could make an argument, I think, that rural states have a preponderance of representation in Washington. That those rural concerns aren't heard more closely by politicians, but clearly the perception out in the heartland is that they're not. So.
Well, and I will say, like the perception that, and I don't think that there is a strong rural representation in Congress right now. And I think we also have to be careful. California has as many Republican representatives in the House as 7 rural Midwestern states combined, right? And so, we're not having a rural policy discourse of real depth. And even the Farm Bill, which is on the agenda for legislation this year, most of the focus is going to be around nutrition programs and around large farm corporate subsidies, but very little is going to be on rural development and economic investment writ large.
Well, this is all really fascinating, and there are so many topics to talk about: housing, broadband. You mentioned incentivizing young folks to move or return to rural areas. The whole opioid question, I think, is another one that's kind of really interesting. And you mentioned the hospitals closing too, or at least some hospitals in rural areas kind of shutting down services they had offered. But we're unfortunately just about out of time. One quick question I'd love to ask you, though, is if you think, and I think you mentioned this towards the start of our conversation, if climate change offers an opportunity for some rural areas, it seems like you said, wind farms, solar farms, just seemed like there are a lot of employment opportunities that might be generated out of, backing away from fossil fuels. Do you think that might be some kind of a game changer in some way, or?
It could be. Again, it depends on how we handle it. You can envision a large solar farm on top of a mountain that's only has a couple of jobs really associated with it once you build it, because you're just kind of automatically maintaining it. Or you could envision lots of solar on lots of rooftops that requires kind of small businesses locally to be able to continue to maintain those in a much different way, in a much more distributed fashion, which actually might be more resilient for the grid overall, actually. And I also think it will come down to, what are the fiscal policies that local governments are enacting on these kinds of things. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't get into kind of an extractive arrangement like we did with minerals. And we're not just kind of extracting the energy out of rural, but that there's some of that value remains, both in terms of jobs and in terms of revenue for local governments to make sure that they're providing the services and the amenities that people are looking for. But yeah, I think there's an enormous opportunity there. And I think, the next 5 years will be an extremely important time, actually, as we make this transition.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Boy, we could talk for a lot longer about all of this. But we're just about out of time here. But Tony Pipa, thank you again very much for making the time for this conversation. Really appreciate it. Okay, well, thanks again to all of you who've been with us. Hope you found our program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day.